Okay, so today we're diving into a case that's both fascinating and incredibly disturbing.
Yeah.
It's the story of Dr. Jeffrey MacDonald.
Mm-hmm.
You've probably heard his name before.
Yeah.
But this story goes so much deeper than just the headlines.
Oh, absolutely.
We're going to be looking at articles, we're going to be looking at court transcripts,
Okay.
and we're going to try and figure out, was he a grieving husband and father who was falsely accused,
Right.
or was he a cold-blooded killer?
It's the big question, isn't it?
It is the big question.
Yeah.
And what makes this deep dive particularly interesting is MacDonald himself.
Right.
I mean, he was a Green Beret.
Yeah.
He was a surgeon.
Mm-hmm.
He was seemingly living the American dream
Yeah.
with his wife, Colette, and their 2 young daughters.
A picture-perfect life.
And then in 1970, everything changes.
Everything changes, yeah.
So right away, you start to wonder, did this facade of the perfect family man hide a dark secret?
That's what we're here to find out.
That is what we are here to find out. To really understand the gravity of what happened that night,
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to first understand who Jeffrey and Colette were as people.
Okay, sure.
What were their aspirations?
Mm-hmm.
What kind of life were they building together?
Well, they were high school sweethearts, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, from Patcho Medford High School in New York.
Okay.
Both of them were extremely popular.
Mm-hmm.
They had an on-again, off-again relationship for a while,
Oh,
but eventually found their way back to each other
yeah.
and got married in 1963.
Okay.
And by all accounts, they seemed to be very happy together.
So they had a good foundation.
Yeah.
Like the kind of love story you read about, you know?
Yeah.
So what happened next?
Well, Jeffrey was incredibly ambitious.
Okay.
And he was devoted to his medical career.
Mm.
He was accepted at Princeton on a 3-year scholarship,
Wow.
but later transferred to Northwestern University.
Okay.
And by 1969, he had graduated from medical school,
Mm-hmm.
completed an internship at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, and he even tacked on an extra 36 hours to his internship to get ahead.
Wow. So he was really driven.
Oh yeah, super driven.
What about Colette?
Well, Colette, in the meantime, was focused on raising their daughters,
Right.
Kimberly, who was 5,
Mm-hmm.
and 2-year-old Kristen.
Okay.
And they were actually expecting a 3rd child.
So it sounds like they were really building this idyllic life.
They were.
Successful doctor,
Mm.
loving wife and mother,
Yep.
beautiful children.
Yeah.
Was there anything else about their life at this point that kind of stands out to you?
Well, Jeffrey wasn't just any doctor. He
Yeah.
was also a Green Beret.
Oh, right. I forgot about that.
Yeah,
Yeah, he had been commissioned to the United States Army in 1969,
that's right.
volunteered to be a Special Forces physician,
Mm-hmm.
received training at various bases,
Yeah.
and ultimately ended up at Fort Bragg in North Carolina.
Uh-huh.
So here we have this seemingly perfect family,
It seems that way.
successful surgeon,
Yeah.
supportive wife,
Mm.
beautiful children, career in the elite Green Berets.
Right.
But as we know, that picture-perfect life was shattered on the night of February 16th, 1970.
It was a really horrific night.
Can you walk us through the timeline of events leading up to the murders?
Well, it's almost eerie how normal everything seemed.
Really?
Almost mundane.
Hmm.
That day, MacDonald took his daughters for a pony ride.
Wow.
On a Shetland pony he'd just bought them. Colette went to her evening class.
Mm-hmm.
They even spent some time together watching TV as a family.
It's that contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
The everyday normalcy, right?
Right.
Knowing this horror that's about to unfold.
Yeah.
Even tucked his daughters into bed.
Mm.
Read them stories.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but that detail really sticks with me.
It's pretty jarring when you think about it.
It is.
I mean, could someone capable of such brutality really go through those motions with genuine care just hours earlier?
Right?
It makes you think.
It really does.
Then at 3:42 a.m., the 911 call comes in.
And everything changes. What did MacDonald say in that 911 call?
It was a frantic call.
Yeah.
You can hear the panic in his voice. He
Mhm.
said, stabbing, 544 Castle Drive. Stabbing, hurry.
Oh, wow.
That's directly from the transcript.
And the military police arrived at their home on Castle Drive, I imagine within minutes.
Oh, yeah, very quickly.
What did they find?
What they found was horrific.
Yeah.
It was a bloodbath.
Oh, my gosh.
Colette was lying on the floor of the master bedroom,
Okay.
brutally beaten and stabbed.
Oh, gosh.
She had a fractured skull, multiple stab wounds to her chest and neck, defensive wounds on her arms.
It's just awful. And the children...
5-year-old Kimberly was in her bed.
Okay.
She had been bludgeoned about the head and stabbed 8 times.
Oh, my gosh.
2-year-old Kristen was also in her bed,
Okay.
stabbed multiple times.
Oh, my goodness.
And the word pig was written in blood on the master bedroom headboard.
It's hard to even imagine that level of violence.
Yeah.
Especially inflicted upon children.
I know. It's just unimaginable.
It's unimaginable.
Where was MacDonald amidst this horrific scene?
Right.
Well, he was found alive,
Okay.
but injured.
Oh.
He had several cuts and bruises, puncture wounds, a partially collapsed lung, and a mild concussion.
Okay.
And the military police rushed him to Womack Army Medical Center, where he spent 9 days recovering.
So MacDonald survives this attack while his entire family is murdered.
Right.
What was his account of what happened that night?
Well, MacDonald claimed that 4 intruders broke into their home,
Okay.
3 men and a woman. He described them as hippie types,
Okay.
echoing the Manson family murders that had terrorized the nation less than a year prior.
Right.
He claimed they attacked him with a baseball bat and an ice pick,
Okay.
shouting things like, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs."
That's a chilling detail.
It is.
Tying the attack to the Manson family.
Right.
And the counterculture movement of the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as we know, investigators quickly started to have doubts about his story.
They did.
Why was that?
Well, now we need to compare what MacDonald told investigators with what the evidence at the scene revealed.
Okay.
And right away, there were inconsistencies.
Okay.
The physical evidence simply didn't support his claims.
Like what?
His injuries, while serious, were suspiciously minor compared to the extreme brutality inflicted on his family.
You mentioned that MacDonald claimed to have been attacked with a baseball bat
Right.
and stabbed with an ice pick.
Yeah.
But his wounds weren't nearly as severe as those inflicted on his family.
No, they weren't.
So the defense argued that his injuries simply didn't match the level of violence that he described.
Exactly.
What kind of discrepancies are we talking about specifically?
Well, for example, his ripped pajama top was found neatly folded under Colette's body.
Okay.
And remember, he claimed there was a struggle, a fight for his life against multiple assailants.
Right.
But there was a distinct lack of signs of a struggle in the living room.
So the scene wasn't reflecting the chaos that MacDonald had described.
Exactly. And there's more.
Okay.
Remember his blue pajama top? He claimed it was pulled over his head during the struggle,
Right.
but it was found around his wrists. These inconsistencies began to raise red flags for investigators.
And remember that detail you mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
About the baby bottle near Kristen's mouth?
Right.
It's such an odd, unsettling element.
It is.
It doesn't seem to fit with anyone's narrative.
No.
Not MacDonald's, and not this image of this chaotic, violent attack by intruders.
It's one of those seemingly insignificant details that often raise the biggest questions.
Right.
Why was the baby bottle there?
Exactly.
Did MacDonald place it there?
Right.
Could it have been part of a genuine attempt to comfort Kristen during the attack?
Yeah.
It's a piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit.
With all these inconsistencies popping up, what direction did the investigation take?
Well, initially, the investigators, specifically the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, or CID,
Okay.
focused on finding evidence of these 4 intruders that MacDonald had described.
Okay.
These 3 men and 1 woman. One supposedly wearing a floppy hat and a blonde wig.
Yeah.
They were looking for a group, possibly drug-addled hippies mimicking the Manson murders,
Oh.
but they came up empty-handed.
So no signs of forced entry.
Nope.
No witnesses placing these alleged intruders at the scene.
Not a one.
And no physical evidence corroborating MacDonald's description of the attackers.
Right.
But then comes a fascinating twist.
There is.
Enter Helena Stoeckley.
Uh-huh.
Now, Stoeckley's involvement in this case is what truly makes it a head-scratcher,
Oh, absolutely.
wouldn't you say?
Yeah, for sure.
So Stoeckley was known around Fayetteville for her drug use
Yeah.
and erratic behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But she claimed something that would change the course of the investigation.
She did.
She claimed to have been at the MacDonald house on the night of the murders.
Wow.
Hold on, she actually admitted to being at the crime scene.
She did.
What did investigators make of that?
Well, it's interesting because her boyfriend at the time, Gregory Mitchell, also claimed that she had confessed to the crime while in a drug-induced haze. And another associate of Stoeckley's, a man named William Posey, placed her at the scene of the crime wearing a floppy hat and a blonde wig,
Wow.
exactly as MacDonald had described.
Okay, so now we have multiple people placing this woman at the scene,
Right.
potentially corroborating MacDonald's story.
Yeah.
You'd think that would be a major breakthrough for the investigation.
You would think so,
Okay.
but it wasn't that simple.
Why?
Despite these statements, investigators remain skeptical of Stoeckley.
Okay.
They dismissed her claims because of her history of drug use and the inconsistencies in her statements.
But they still investigated her.
Right, yeah.
I mean, did they ever take a polygraph?
They did administer a polygraph test.
Okay.
But it was ruled inconclusive
Okay.
because she was considered too unstable.
So despite these potentially crucial witness statements, the focus of the investigation remained on MacDonald.
It did.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
You have this woman known for her unreliability,
Right.
essentially confessing to being at the crime scene.
Yeah,
And investigators basically shrug it off.
pretty much.
You have to wonder, was it simply because of her drug use and inconsistencies?
Yeah.
Or was there something more to it?
Right.
Was there a reason they were so quick to dismiss her and keep the focus on MacDonald?
It's a question worth considering.
It is.
And it's one that continues to fuel debate about this case even today.
All right, so we've got a brutal crime scene.
Yeah.
We've got a suspect with a story that doesn't quite add up.
Right.
And we've got a potential witness with her own questionable claims.
Mm-hmm.
What happens next?
Well,
Does MacDonald get arrested right away?
no, not immediately.
Okay.
The case dragged on for years
Oh, wow.
with investigations and legal maneuvers
Okay.
before it finally went to trial.
Okay.
In the meantime, MacDonald actually received an honorable discharge from the Army in December 1970
Really?
after the Army dropped all military charges against him.
So he walked free for a while.
Yes, for a time.
Okay.
But the case wasn't closed.
Right.
In 1975, he was indicted by a federal grand jury in Raleigh, North Carolina,
Okay.
on 3 counts of murder.
Okay, so 5 years after the murders,
Yeah.
MacDonald is finally facing a trial.
He is.
What was his defense strategy?
His defense team, led by Bernard Segal,
Okay.
focused on attacking the Army's investigation.
Okay.
They argued that it was incompetent and that crucial evidence had been mishandled.
So they were basically saying that the investigation was so flawed
Right.
that it was impossible to say with certainty what had happened.
Exactly. They pointed to the lost fingerprints.
Right.
The fact that MacDonald's pajama bottoms, which could have held valuable clues,
Yeah.
were thrown away at the hospital.
I remember that.
And the failure to properly secure the crime scene.
Mm-hmm.
They argued that all of these errors created reasonable doubt about MacDonald's guilt.
Did they call Helena Stoeckley to the stand?
They did. Stoeckley testified that she had vague memories of being at the MacDonald house that night,
Okay.
but couldn't recall any specifics.
Given her history, was her testimony even considered?
Ultimately, her testimony was considered unreliable
Oh,
because of her drug use and mental instability.
right.
The jury didn't give it much weight.
So, despite the defense's efforts to highlight the flaws in the investigation and raise doubts about MacDonald's guilt,
Mm-hmm.
he was ultimately convicted.
Yes, in a complex trial full of twists and turns.
Wow.
The jury found MacDonald guilty of second-degree murder for his wife's death
Okay.
and first-degree murder for the deaths of his daughters.
Wow.
He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms.
Wow. Guilty on all charges.
Yeah.
Case closed, right?
Not quite.
Okay.
This is where things get even more complicated.
Right.
The controversy surrounding the investigation, the conflicting accounts,
Mm-hmm.
and the lingering questions about Helena Stoeckley's involvement
Yeah.
have kept this story alive.
Yeah.
And new evidence emerged over the years,
Okay.
prompting MacDonald to appeal his conviction multiple times.
So even after the guilty verdict, the story doesn't end there.
It doesn't.
I think we need to take a deeper look at some of the questionable aspects of the investigation that you mentioned.
Okay, yeah.
What exactly were some of the major criticisms?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms, as the defense team argued, was the mishandling of the crime scene.
Okay.
Remember, this happened on a military base.
Right.
So the Army CID was in charge,
Yep.
and there were several missteps that cast a shadow over their work.
I'm particularly curious about the fact that they threw away MacDonald's pajama bottoms.
Yeah.
That seems almost unbelievable.
It does raise eyebrows.
It does.
I mean, those could have been crucial evidence.
It fueled suspicion of incompetence, maybe even a cover-up.
It did.
And that wasn't the only mistake.
No.
Fingerprints were lost because no resin was applied to surfaces before tape was lifted.
Yeah, that's a big one.
So there's a real possibility that crucial evidence was either lost or contaminated.
There is.
And that makes it even harder to determine what truly happened that night.
It does.
It raises that nagging question: if the investigation had been handled perfectly,
Right.
would the outcome have been different?
Mm-hmm.
Might more evidence have been found to support MacDonald's claims?
It's possible.
It's almost like the investigation itself becomes part of the mystery.
Absolutely. And it's a significant reason why this case continues to attract so much attention.
Right.
People are left wondering if we'll ever truly know what happened in that house on Fort Bragg back in 1970.
This is a good place to pause, I think.
Okay.
We've laid out the foundation of the case.
Yeah.
And in part 2, we'll delve deeper into the evidence that convinced the jury of MacDonald's guilt.
Okay.
And the lingering questions that continue to fuel debate about his innocence.
Sounds good.
All right. See you next time.
Looking forward to it.
Bye.
Bye.
Welcome back. We've been unpacking the Jeffrey MacDonald case.
Yeah, it's a wild one.
We got this seemingly perfect family. The brutal murders, the inconsistencies in his story, a potentially unreliable witness who claimed to be at the scene.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack here, and despite a guilty verdict, the debate about his guilt or innocence continues to rage on.
Oh, for sure. It's the kind of case that just stays with you.
It does.
It really does. And it was a media sensation at the time.
It was.
I mean, the idea of this handsome Green Beret doctor who claimed his family was murdered by drug-crazed hippies.
Right.
It just captivated the public's imagination.
It sounds like something straight out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
Let's talk about the trial itself.
Okay.
What were the key pieces of evidence that the prosecution presented? What convinced the jury that MacDonald was guilty?
Well, the prosecution's case really hinged on the idea that MacDonald's story was a complete fabrication.
Okay.
A carefully constructed lie to cover up his own crime.
Okay.
They emphasized those inconsistencies that we talked about, between his account and the physical evidence.
You mentioned that MacDonald claimed to have been attacked with a baseball bat and stabbed with an ice pick. But his wounds weren't nearly as severe as those inflicted on his family.
Right. And remember, the defense argued that his injuries simply didn't match the level of violence that he described.
But the prosecution had a counter-argument, didn't they?
They did. They suggested that MacDonald could have intentionally inflicted those wounds on himself.
Okay, to make his story more believable.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we're looking at this from the prosecution's perspective, they're painting a picture of MacDonald as someone capable of not only murdering his family, but also harming himself to support his lies.
Yeah, that's what they were going for.
So what other evidence did they use to bolster that theory?
Well, they focused on the lack of defensive wounds on MacDonald.
Okay.
Their argument was, if he had truly been in a desperate struggle for his life against multiple attackers, wouldn't there be more signs of a fight on his body? They also brought in expert witnesses to testify about blood spatter patterns and fiber analysis, all to show that the forensic evidence didn't line up with MacDonald's version of events.
It sounds like they were building a strong case against him. Was there any physical evidence that directly linked MacDonald to the murders?
Well, one piece of physical evidence that stood out was a pair of blue surgical gloves found in the master bedroom. Now, these gloves were similar to the ones MacDonald used at work, although he denied knowing how they ended up there.
It seems like a pretty incriminating detail.
It was certainly presented that way.
Yeah.
The prosecution argued that it was a careless mistake, a sign that he'd forgotten to dispose of the gloves after committing the murders.
Okay, so we're starting to see the prosecution's case take shape here. But what about the defense?
Right.
If MacDonald didn't do it, then who did? What was their theory of the case?
Well, the defense strategy was twofold.
Okay.
First, they tried to highlight the weaknesses in the prosecution's case and create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors.
Okay.
They argued that the investigation was so riddled with errors and mishandled evidence that it was impossible to say with certainty what had transpired that night.
They really hammered on that botched investigation, didn't they?
Oh, they did. And for good reason.
Yeah.
It was a significant part of their strategy. They emphasized the lost fingerprints, the discarded pajama bottoms, the overall failure to properly secure the crime scene. They argued that these missteps by the CID cast doubt on the entire investigation and the prosecution's conclusions.
And what about Helena Stoeckley? Did the defense attempt to use her testimony to support MacDonald's claim that intruders were involved?
They did. They called her to the stand.
Okay.
And she testified that she had vague memories of being at the MacDonald house that night.
Okay.
But couldn't remember specifics.
But her testimony was ultimately dismissed as unreliable, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Unfortunately for the defense, Stoeckley's history of drug use and mental instability made her an unreliable witness in the eyes of the jury.
Yeah.
They didn't give her testimony much weight.
So despite the defense's best efforts, the jury ultimately sided with the prosecution.
They did, and this case became a landmark legal battle.
It did.
After MacDonald's conviction, he appealed several times,
Okay.
arguing that the trial was unfair and that new evidence pointed to his innocence.
I'm curious about those appeals. Was there any substantial new evidence that emerged after the trial that could potentially exonerate MacDonald?
There was, and it's a major reason why this case remains so controversial.
Sure.
In the years since MacDonald's conviction,
Yeah.
his supporters have pointed to several pieces of evidence that they believe cast doubt on his guilt.
Okay, like what?
Well, one example is a lab report written by CID agent Robert Shaw
Okay.
that referenced blue pajama top threads
Okay.
found beneath Colette's body.
Okay.
Now, this report suggested that these threads came from an unknown source, which is a big deal because MacDonald's blue pajama top had been torn,
Right.
presumably during a struggle with the intruders.
So this report implies that someone other than MacDonald was wearing that blue pajama top?
It does.
Isn't that a pretty significant detail?
It's like finding a missing puzzle piece.
Yeah.
The defense argued that these threads could have belonged to one of the intruders that MacDonald had described,
Right.
but the prosecution dismissed this report as a simple error,
Okay.
claiming that the threads actually matched MacDonald's pajama top.
With conflicting interpretations like that, it's hard to know what to believe.
Exactly, and this is where the question of guilt or innocence becomes even more difficult to answer.
It does.
Are we looking at a manipulative sociopath who was able to fool everyone?
Right.
Even Joe McGinnis,
Right, yeah.
author who initially believed him?
Yeah.
Or are we looking at a flawed investigation that resulted in the wrongful conviction of an innocent man?
You mentioned Joe McGinnis. Didn't he write a book about the case?
He did. McGinnis was initially hired by MacDonald himself to write a book proving his innocence.
Oh, wow.
He was given unprecedented access to MacDonald, his family, and his legal team.
Wow.
But as McGinnis delved deeper into the case,
Okay.
he began to doubt MacDonald's story.
And this is where it gets really interesting. He ultimately became convinced of MacDonald's guilt.
He did!
And he wrote a scathing book called Fatal Vision,
Yeah,
which became a bestseller.
it did.
The book detailed the case and presented a compelling argument for MacDonald's guilt,
Right.
painting him as a cold-blooded killer and a master manipulator.
Uh-huh.
Talk about a plot twist.
I know, right?
Did MacDonald take legal action against McGinnis?
He did. MacDonald sued McGinnis for fraud,
Okay.
claiming that he had breached their contract, but the case was eventually settled out of court.
Even though the lawsuit was settled, the damage was already done. Fatal Vision had a major impact on public perception,
Oh, absolutely.
swaying public opinion against MacDonald
Yeah.
and solidifying the image of him as a murderer.
For sure.
The book and the subsequent lawsuit added a whole new layer of complexity to an already convoluted case.
Right.
It raised questions about objectivity and truth-telling in journalism and the ethics of profiting from someone else's tragedy.
Big questions.
It's a fascinating example of how the media can shape public opinion,
It is.
especially in high-profile cases like this.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder, would the public have perceived MacDonald differently
Right.
if Fatal Vision hadn't been published?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the book clearly played a role in shaping the narrative surrounding MacDonald and the case. But let's get back to the appeals process.
Yeah.
What other evidence did MacDonald's legal team present in their attempts to overturn his conviction?
Well, they focused on the inconsistencies in the investigation and the questionable handling of evidence.
Right.
But they also heavily emphasized Helena Stoeckley's statements
Right.
and her potential involvement in the murders.
But didn't the prosecution dismiss her claims as the ramblings of a drug-addled woman seeking attention?
They did, but it gets even more complicated.
How so?
While Stoeckley died in 1983 before her death, she reportedly gave several statements to people claiming she was present at the MacDonald house during the murders.
Wow.
Now, these statements were never presented at trial,
Good.
but formed the basis for later appeals.
So decades later, we're still debating whether Jeffrey MacDonald is a victim of a flawed investigation or a cunning killer who orchestrated this horrific crime. It's a lot to process.
It really is. There's evidence that supports both sides of the argument.
Right.
And as we've discussed, the investigation itself was far from perfect. The brutality of the crime scene, the fact that 2 young children were murdered in their beds, it's hard to reconcile that image with the idea of a loving father and devoted husband.
It's a haunting thought. But let's talk about the outcome of the appeals. Was MacDonald ever granted a new trial?
No, he wasn't. His appeals were denied, and he remains in prison to this day.
So where does that leave us? Is there any possibility that this case will ever be definitively solved? Is there any hope for MacDonald to clear his name?
There's always a possibility.
Okay.
In 2017, MacDonald and his legal team again asked the Fourth Circuit to overturn his convictions.
What was the basis for this appeal?
This time, they presented evidence about 3 hairs found at the crime scene.
Okay.
The DNA from these hairs didn't match anyone involved in the case.
No.
Not MacDonald, not the victims, not any known associate.
So potentially, these 3 hairs could belong to the intruders that MacDonald described all those years ago.
Exactly. And with the incredible advances in DNA technology,
Right.
these hairs could potentially hold the key to finally unraveling this mystery.
It's a reminder that even in cold cases like this new evidence can emerge and bring us closer to the truth.
That's true.
And in a case like this, with the line between truth and deception is so blurry, uncovering the truth is more important than ever.
I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground here,
Yeah.
but the Jeffrey MacDonald case goes even deeper than what we've discussed.
Oh, it does?
We'll explore those additional layers and what they mean for this complicated story in Part 3. Okay, we are back, and man, what a journey this Jeffrey MacDonald case has been.
It's a tough one.
We've got the picture-perfect family.
Right.
We've got the horrific crime. We've got the inconsistencies.
Yeah.
We've got a potentially unreliable witness, a botched investigation,
Oh.
a controversial book that really just muddied the waters.
Yeah, it's really a story that just stays with you, doesn't it?
It does.
You know, it's a case that really challenges you to think critically,
Yeah.
to examine your own biases, and to really grapple with the idea that sometimes the truth might be more complex and more elusive than we'd like to believe.
Right.
We may never have a definitive answer about what happened that night.
Right.
But exploring the different possibilities and examining the evidence can help us understand how a case like this could remain unsolved for so long.
Right. You mentioned earlier that there are even more layers to this story.
There are.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure.
What else should we consider
Yeah.
as we try to make sense of this case?
Well, one thing we haven't talked much about is the role of the media in shaping public perception of the case.
Right.
From the very beginning, this was a story that just captured the nation's attention.
It did.
The image of the handsome Green Beret doctor,
Right.
the brutal murders of his young family, the claims of a Manson-like attack.
Right.
It had all the elements of a sensational true crime story.
It really did. And we know that the media can sometimes intentionally or unintentionally influence the way a case is perceived and even investigated. Do you think that happened here?
I think it's certainly a possibility. You know, the media coverage was expensive.
It was.
And it often focused on the more sensational aspects of the case.
Right. And then, of course, you have the publication of Fatal Vision,
Right.
which, as we discussed, had a significant impact on public opinion,
Yeah.
swaying many people toward believing MacDonald was guilty.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine what it must have been like for MacDonald to have his story scrutinized and debated so publicly, to be portrayed as a cold-blooded killer in a best-selling book, and then to have his appeals repeatedly denied.
I can't imagine.
You know, it's a reminder that behind the headlines and the legal arguments, there's a human being at the center of this story, someone whose life has been irrevocably altered by the events of that night.
Regardless of whether you believe he's guilty or innocent,
Yeah.
you have to acknowledge the profound impact this case has had on him and on everyone involved.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember the victims in all of this.
Yes, it is.
Colette, Kimberly, Kristen.
Right.
Their lives were tragically cut short.
Yeah.
Their stories are often overshadowed by the focus on MacDonald and his claims of innocence.
Their loss is unimaginable, and we shouldn't let their memories be forgotten amidst the complexities and controversies of the case.
We shouldn't.
So we've examined the evidence.
We have.
We've explored the different perspectives, and we've discussed the lingering questions. As we wrap up our deep dive into the Jeffrey MacDonald case, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can we learn from this story?
I think this case serves as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of justice is rarely simple or straightforward.
Right.
It's a complex process that can be influenced by human error, by bias, and external factors like media coverage and public opinion.
It also highlights the fact that even with seemingly overwhelming evidence, there can still be room for doubt, for alternative explanations, and for the possibility of a miscarriage of justice.
That's true.
This deep dive has been an incredible journey, and I think it's safe to say that we've all learned something from it. We've seen how a seemingly perfect life can be shattered in an instant, how a web of circumstantial evidence can lead to a conviction, and how the pursuit of justice can be a long and winding road.
It can be.
And we've seen how a single case can spark decades of debate, raising questions about the reliability of our memories, the influence of the media, and the very nature of truth itself.
It's quite a story.
It really is, and it's a story that will likely continue to fascinate and perplex people for years to come. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Jeffrey MacDonald case. If you enjoyed this episode and you're ready to explore more fascinating stories, be sure to subscribe to our podcast and check out the resources mentioned on our website.
Yeah, and be sure to let us know what you think.
We always love hearing from you.
We do.
All right, until next time, stay curious and keep asking questions.
Absolutely.